You know, on paper, Company of Heroes 3 sounds like a dream sequel, like what the COH community have always been asking for, all rolled into one pretty little package. We are getting 4 starting factions, we are getting modding support right out the gate, we are getting 2 separate and unique dynamic campaigns, and the developers Relic are adding in every cool little vehicle the community has ever asked for. The Panzer III, it's in there. The M3 Grant, it's in there as well. The game is overflowing with World War II curiosities. Everything from the obscure yet common things like the Leichte Infantry Geschütz or LIG, and all the way to the hardcore, weird and unusual like the M29 Weasel. And yet, after now coming fairly fresh from having played the game on stream for some 7 hours, I cannot escape the feeling that there is something coarse about all of this, something unfinished, as if the game just hasn't been refined fully, as if, frankly, in a way, Relic may not even be able to fully refine it anymore. The blades have grown dull, so to say, and they can no longer produce quite the same quality as they once did. So many parts of COH 3 sound excellent, and yet playing it, it feels like everything's just not quite there. Like COH, the old school Company of Heroes, the very first one that took the RTS world by storm and revolutionized the genre back in 2006, is just barely out of reach. It's in the room, it's almost mockingly close, and yet you can't touch it. And it isn't a single thing. It isn't a single gameplay element or an overarching design choice or anything like that. It is just this befuddling lack of finish, not even necessarily polish. The game runs excellently, at least for me. I've seen a lot of people complain that their systems can't run the game well, or who are experiencing random frame drops. Even some claiming that they can't actually even get into the game as it crashes on the main menu. I haven't experienced any of that, so I can't comment, but from my experience, the game was running very smoothly. We had one single disconnect over the course of the 7 hours of gameplay, and one example of a person not loading into the game and so kicking us all back to the lobby. Compared to the launch of Company of Heroes 2, for example, that's quite good. But the overall delivery, all of it, just is all slightly subpar. As if Company of Heroes 3, it genuinely feels like the dollar store version of Company of Heroes. It feels like a knockoff, like something you'd find on the street in a market with a misspelled brand name on it, kinda. Company of Heroic People 3, something like that. And this is probably due to the simple fact that Relic is no longer the company it once was. It is no longer capable of delivering the degree of finish that it once was. And this is particularly painful when one takes into consideration that Relic genuinely was one of the titans of the real-time strategy gaming market. They revolutionized the genre again and again. Dawn of War 1 started it with excellent sync kills, fantastic gameplay, and of course one of the first truly big and successful entries of 40k into video games. Company of Heroes followed it up and revolutionized both gameplay and visuals with the then brand spanking new Essence engine. Dawn of War 2 simply solidified the success of 1, but then the problems started happening. Their then publisher THQ went all in on Etch-a-Sketches, essentially. and went bankrupt, even as Relic was developing Company of Heroes 2. Luckily, the company was bought up by Sega, and thank God for that, because when the game was originally supposed to be released, it was in an extraordinarily rough state, and would have bombed fully were it not for the extra months granted to the team by Sega. As it was, Company of Heroes 2 came out, and it certainly did not rock the world like Dawn of War or COH 1 had, but over the years it was eventually accepted as a relatively decent sequel to Company of Heroes, a middle-of-the-road acceptable product. Then, of course, there was Dawn of War 3, a unmitigated disaster. And all the paid-off reviews in the world could not save it from having Relic shut down all support from the game shortly after launch due to disastrous sales figures, which reduced the, again aforementioned, titan of the real-time strategy gaming industry to a contract worker for Microsoft on Age of Empires 4, which, to be fair, they did a pretty damn good job with, but the mighty had fallen far, and now with Company of Heroes 3, there is the opportunity to finally redeem the name Relic Entertainment and take back the title of king of the real-time strategy genre, one certainly not overflowing with potential at the moment. And yet it just... I said this with Dawn of War 3, that I felt as if the team no longer had the sheer raw talent, the vision and the programming skills to pull off what old Relic did. And again, I must repeat that criticism here. There are so many elements that walks and kind of talks like Company of Heroes, and yet it is all a bit of a hollow mask, a skin suit that falls apart under closer scrutiny. Beginning with the visuals. The game looks weird. Luckily, they have finally been able to solve the problem with the incredible brightness of the previous technical tests, where the game felt like it would just straight up blind you, and with no way to actually adjust the brightness slider. The game was at times downright painful to play. I got a literal migraine after just a few hours, but now after 7 hours of gameplay it was entirely fine, so thank God they fixed that. But the color choices themselves, the models, the detail level, everything looks fuzzy and indistinct. It is at times genuinely difficult to see the troops on the battlefield as they kind of just blend in and sink into the environment. Even zooming in, all you really see is like the little nasty details, like zooming in on a bunker and seeing an incredibly jagged and bright edge as if the texture just kind of stopped there, or zooming in on the tanks and seeing the battle damage, and at first you're like, oh my god, dynamic scarring on the vehicles, wow! And then you realize all of the scarring is just a 2D texture painted onto the tank, and it's identical for all tanks, so it's not actually dynamic at all. It's just a 2D texture layer painted on top of the vehicle as it takes hit points damage. And eventually, it just ends up looking goddamn ugly. Even the terrain deformation, as the battlefield is filled with scars and craters, etc., you quickly realize that none of them are actual scars or craters. They are yet again simple, flat 2D textures painted onto the landscape. It all feels cheap and underwhelming, and so not what you expect of Relic, especially not in the current year. See, Relic is in a way currently being crushed under the weight of the expectations of its amazing predecessors. Company of Heroes was a revolution, and so to see Company of Heroes 3 be just a game is disappointing. There's also the problems with the art style, which seems to have 3 different directions now. To begin with, you have the incredibly colourful and bright style of the cover and the splash screen. It's cartoony in a way. Look at the German's chin, for example, or the American. It all looks like a CGI cartoon or something. And then in game you have this, which is far more of the classical Company of Heroes style, and yet it too feels cheap, unfinished, low detail. Like, I'm pretty sure I produce better art for my lore series than this. And yes, it is a technical multiplayer test. Maybe all of the visuals aren't final, maybe there are better assets in the full game, but it's 6 weeks away. And they took them months to fix the fact that the screen was literally glowing with the brightness of a dying star in the last few tests. Somehow, I just don't think all of this will be magically high poly and detailed and clear and distinct in another month and a half. But hey, visuals aren't everything. So long as the gameplay is solid, it hardly matters. But the gameplay too struggles with the same issues, and that it feels almost right and yet not quite. Now, there are balance issues, but hey, it's a Relic strategy game. When aren't there blatantly painful balance issues? At the moment, for example, the British Piat? God, that is simply just a dark memory from previous games. The boys' anti-tank rifle is way too good for what it is. It is an anti-tank rifle that obviously eats half-tracks for lunch, like you wouldn't believe. It simply just disappears them. They run up to your lines and then they're no longer there, leaving behind a scared and scattered band of panzer grenadiers who were riding it, thinking that they were the Panzer Elite from Company of Heroes 1, running circles around you, firing their little SMGs. No, not this one. The half-tracks in general feel like absolute tissue paper and get easily beaten by your average rifle squad, all of which can easily penetrate its armor, which is essentially non-existent. Amusingly enough, even the British Dingo, tiny little armoured car thingy-bob, is better than the half-tracks. Granted, the half-tracks can eventually be upgraded, but it is through a long and weird upgrade path that requires you to pick several side upgrades before finally getting to the one that allows you to upgrade your half-tracks. All of which is not really explained through the tooltips, which is mildly frustrating, but again, the boy's anti-tank rifle, and it doesn't just eat half-tracks either, it also kills straight-up tanks, and the overwhelming majority of the Afrika Korps armor, which is light stuff like martyrs, oh, it absolutely noms that like no beginnings, and better yet, it doesn't even really reduce the squad's anti-infantry capabilities either. Yes, I've got some choice word for the Piat. More dark memories. The boy's anti-tank rifle. It also feels like the meta right now is rather stale, as in, build 2 machine guns, then build mortars, then build many bunkers, but I think that is more of a getting to know the video game issue rather than a real balance problem. I also certainly do feel that the Allies are a bit more powerful than the Germans, as with the Germans I keep feeling as if I'm starved of everything, constantly. Munitions, fuel, and manpower. And yet as the Americans, even though you have to build tons of buildings to unlock anything, I always feel like I am overflowing with resources. Heavens knows why, but let's get away from the balance, which is always going to be dodgy, and again, it is a multiplayer tech test. This is kind of where they want to try this stuff out, and more into the general gameplay. So, one of the first things is that cover is God. It is absolutely everything. If you are in cover, you can take an absolute pounding, whereas if you are not, you are going to die very quickly. This I quite like because it rewards tactical maneuvering. You can still outflank cover, obviously, and you can still get into advantageous positions and win some very nice battles. Even when paired up against the exact same number of enemy troops, you can potentially secure a rather crushing victory if you do well. This rewards the player for, well, being good at the video game, which is always quite nice. Again, I have to curse the British in that they get a rifle grenade that is incredibly cheap, incredibly fast, and detonates immediately on impact. Kinda like the Panzer Elite rifle grenade, except even goddamn better. That thing is a pain in the butthole, but again, such is life. But the battlefield itself, it doesn't feel as dynamic, as good and interesting. A lot of the units feel rather weak early on, like they can't quite get the damage output that you would expect of them. Many of the light vehicles too feel really underwhelming, not really paying for themselves like you'd think. The early Greyhound rush in Company of Heroes 1, for example, was one of my favoured strategies, as if you could maneuver and micro that little thing well, oh boy did it pay for itself, and it could be an enormous pain in your opponent's ass. Whereas here, it takes so much damage from anything and everything. And when you run up against dedicated anti-tank weaponry, everything feels squishier. Although I wonder if this is just my emotion, because counting it out, it seems to me that vehicles take more or less the same amount of damage that I'm used to, or maybe 10-20% more. Regardless, the vehicle gameplay feels a lot quicker, to the point that even something like a Tiger, which is the heaviest piece of armor in the game at the moment, goes down remarkably quickly to a couple of M18 Hellcats. It also feels like the Africa Corps' focus on punch rather than defense also makes the game feel a bit more hitty when it comes to armored vehicles. The Marder dies so soon as somebody farts in its general direction, but a couple of those things cost very little fuel and can happily stand up to vehicles many times their cost. But again, if you leave them exposed for even a nanosecond, they're no longer on the battlefield. In many ways, I feel like this should be a change for the better, because it balances the idea of offense versus defense a bit more intuitively, I feel. I feel like I'm more careful with a lot of my vehicles, and I also feel rewarded when I am. But I'm going to need more time to really suss that one out properly. Some of the vehicles do feel incredibly underwhelming though. The Panzer IV, for example, just doesn't feel like it's worth it. Meanwhile, the Panzer III, which should not be all that good considering the stuff it goes up against, is really damned solid. Some of the vehicles too can feel maybe a little bit too good. Like the British getting access to the Bishop artillery piece, for example, very early and for a very low cost can be devastating to the opposition, especially as the infantry-focused gameplay has also seen quite a few interesting little changes. Infantry squads are a lot stickier this time around. It is quite difficult to kill one, and I am happy to say it is very difficult to have one simply just disappear due to a lucky mortar or artillery strike. In fact, despite their increased usage and accuracy, I feel like mortars are no longer anywhere near as lethal as they once were, meaning that you can take a few more risks, but due to the increased squishiness of squads, you can't really stick around for that long. How do I put it? On the one hand, squads in cover can take a far greater beating and hold out against far greater odds for far longer. An infantry squad versus an infantry squad can be a fairly long and interesting engagement. But the moment you throw in something like a grenade, you lose half of a squad's hit points instantaneously. Mortars as well begin chipping away at health rather quickly, but it doesn't outright delete them. I actually think that the infantry combat has been struck upon relatively well, as I haven't had almost any of those truly infuriating experiences where a squad just disappears out of nowhere and you feel like you had no way to stop it from happening. Another positive thing about the infantry combat is that there are a lot of upgrades for many of the factions. The Africa Corps in particular have a whole ton of them. Many other units also have several weapons upgrades or specializations, which I very much so like, as it gives a great deal of options and adds in more variety to the gameplay. In many ways, I'm actually rather fond of the gameplay in theory. When I'm sitting here talking about it, I'm thinking to myself, I actually quite like many of these changes, and yet playing it all feels just again kind of weird. I think it is the visual presentation in many cases that just throws you off, because I quite enjoyed several of the games. Some of the games were absolutely dreadful, but that was less due to outright balance issues, with the exceptions of the British rifle grenades and the boys anti-tank rifle in general, but more due to frustrations with controls, which can be a little bit derpy. The fastest vehicles, for example, can get a little bit difficult to control. The heavier ones feel pretty good, and the addition of things like the M3 Grant with its dual turret system is a very interesting idea that I feel maybe wasn't fully explored to the logical ends of it. Like, it would be nice if the top turret had great penetration and the bottom one had great HE, for example, as that is what they were originally intended to be. The top turret of the Lee and the Grant was intended to be a high-velocity 37mm cannon to be used against enemy armor, whereas the low-velocity 75 mounted in the hull was intended as an infantry support weapon firing high explosives. And speaking of the vehicles, there are a lot of unique vehicles in the various combat doctrines now. They've gone back to allowing you to choose from 1 out of 3 on the fly in the match, which is excellent, and the ones they've got available at the moment feel pretty good. Even though I didn't get to play with all of them, none of them felt remarkably bad, though some were certainly more underwhelming than others. I was not a fan of the British Commandos, for example. But still, the more and more I think about it, I feel as if the general flow of the gameplay is actually pretty nice. Definitely a bit slower than the Company of Heroes 1 and 2, certainly, but it might also be an unfamiliarity with the game and its mechanics, and not knowing quite how to utilize the various units or their abilities to the fullest either, as many units felt incredibly good. The Italian assault engineers, for example, are awesome. They're one of the spongiest units in the game, they feel like, and being able to equip them with flamethrowers as well as short-range SMGs makes them real, genuine monsters, especially if decently supported by longer-range anti-tank infantry, which the Germans admittedly have in scarce quantities. But I return to the presentation, because even if the gameplay feels fair enough, the game, I expected it to look so much better, to sound so much better. That might be a huge thing, because Company of Heroes, both 1 and 2, and Dawn of War as well, all had exceptional sound design. One of the key hallmarks of Relic Entertainment was always their amazing voice acting and their fantastic sound design. Hearing the Stukas of Fuss fire for the first time in Company of Heroes 2, I was like, man, that is amazing. But now, many of the sounds, they are dull. They're clinky. They lack oomph and weight. The British Lee Enfield in particular was very disappointing. It does not sound like a bolt-action rifle. It sounds puny, like an air rifle. Even their 5.5-inch howitzer has this hollow thud rather than a boom, you know? The sound design is a big letdown. They do have some cool little voice lines here and there. My favorite one from the Americans is "sweating like a whore in church." That one was pretty good. But none of it really stood out. You know, I had none of those, wow, listen to that kind of moments. And combined with the underwhelming visual appearance, it just makes the game feel lesser. It makes me continuously compare it to what I knew was better. And oh god, the stuff like the aircraft. The Heinkel 111 still occasionally parked on some of the maps still have that weird, plastically, not at all glass-looking cockpits, as if they just didn't quite bother to finish them. Then there's the generalized fuzzy appearance of everything, and the apparent low quality of the models and the textures, etc. Even though the game requires a pretty heavy-duty rig to run, it all just feels again, kind of like a dollar store version of Company of Heroes. The overall impression undermines what I feel were actually pretty damn good gameplay changes. I feel like if I was telling myself 5 years ago about these gameplay changes, I'd be, that is exactly what I wanted for Company of Heroes 2. Just like the additional mechanics too. Wait, you're telling me that the COH3 will come with 4 factions, 2 dynamic campaigns, buttload of units, and towable weapons? Wow, this is great! And it is, and yet it doesn't feel like it. It's genuinely kind of weird of a sensation as I'm sitting here. I'm like, I had fun. I wasn't super frustrated about the game, and yet I feel almost as if that was the problem. I feel as if I should have been more frustrated, because if I was, it meant that I was more involved. It meant that I had a deeper connection to the game. I took it more seriously. I had more investment in it. And instead, after playing it for 7 hours and having a fair bit of fun, I'm like, that was a thing, but I don't know if it really stirred my emotions, if you will forgive me. Hardly concrete feedback, I agree. And yet, it really is just those things. The gameplay feels pretty damn solid in most regards. I agree with practically all of the changes, but combined with the underwhelming audio-visual experience, it just doesn't deliver that wow effect. It just doesn't deliver the Company of Heroes effect. It feels watered down, as if I should expect a lot more from Relic. To the point where I would kind of say that the game has the inverse problem of Iron Harvest. Iron Harvest had key and easily identifiable gameplay issues. The game was way too slow. It took forever to Infantry to get into the fight, and when they did, when they got routed, it took them forever to get back to the front line again. The game was sludgy and turgid. Even the mechs themselves, an awesome idea, were big, fat, slow, unmaneuverable, and very difficult to salvage if they got into a bad position, making the Polanian chicken walkers, for example, the kings of the universe because they could move at a reasonable speed. But the visuals were brilliant, excellent, and the music and the audio was on point, whereas here, it's the exact opposite. I find myself warming more and more to the gameplay and cooling more and more to actually playing and watching the game unfold. At the end of the day, Company of Heroes 3, as far as it stands right now in the multiplayer tech test, is most certainly not a bad game. It's just not a great game either, and it certainly does not live up to the legacy of its predecessors. But a lot of it might also have to do with getting used to it, with adjusting one's expectations and figuring out how the game plays differently from 2 and 1. I'm gonna have to play it a lot more to make up my mind firmly on it, but for right now, this feels like a middle-of-the-road product. An underwhelming entry in the Company of Heroes series, likely to be heading for mixed reviews at best on the Steam page. And I'm not at all sure that Relic can survive another one of those. But at the end of the day, what can one do? The brain drain seems to have struck Relic rather hard, and it'll be rather difficult for them to extricate themselves from their current position of apparent mediocrity. But we will have to wait and see for the fully released version before we can absolutely make a ruling on this game, as I intend to play the technical test a bit further and definitely look it up on launch, so we will see. Until next time, I have been Arch. As always, thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.